Hi, this is Sophie from the Isobel Craft Collection, and I thought I'd do another video and maybe do one on some basics rather than techniques. We'll do techniques in the future, and I've got sort of quite a few exciting ones to go for with that. But I think we all need to know how to create a decent stamped image, and there are a variety of things that you need before you can create a decent stamped image. It's not easy. You need to have a variety of inks, variety of papers, acrylic blocks, etc. So I'm just going to go through the different possibilities. Okay, so for cards you need either Centura Pearl, that's what Sheena Douglas used to recommend before she brought her own range out. And on this side it's pearlised, but the back of it is a really decent card basically. So it's really good to stamp on the back of Centura Pearl. But equally, there are other makes. For example, I'm going to use this Hourly Speciality Paper stamping cardstock. Okay, so I've got my Centura Pearl and my stamping cardstock. So that's the first thing you need. The second thing you need is a variety of inks, because you need to think about what medium you're going to colour your stamps in with, and it varies depending on what ink pad you use and the type of ink, type of stamps that you've got. Okay, so the four main ink pads that really you should go for are the following. VersaFine, okay, so this is an oil-based pigment ink. It creates fantastic clear stamped images, but it takes a while to dry, so that's one thing to be aware of. You have to make sure it's really dry before you start colouring in. The next one is Memento ink, which is also a dye-based ink, and this is when you use your alcohol markers, okay, because you can't have alcohol markers with other ink pads because they can kind of you could have a problem with it basically. So Memento is the right ink pad to have with alcohol markers. However, if you're using water-based markers, then you need a solvent ink pad and you need a StazOn ink pad, because if you have a solvent ink pad with solvent or alcohol based markers, they actually clash. Okay, you cannot use alcohol markers with a solvent ink pad. The solvent ink pad is for watercolours or things like distress markers, for example. And finally, if you're really struggling to get a decent image, sometimes the only way forward is to have a clear ink pad and use embossing powders. Now I'll show embossing powders in another video, but basically to be able to create a stamped image using embossing powders, for example, I've got a heated up silver embossing powder here, you need a clear ink. So you stamp the image in the clear ink, you add the embossing powder, you get rid of the excess and heat it up with a heat gun. But we'll do that in a later stage. But really, the main ink pads are your solvent based, your dye based and your oil based. Okay. So we also need to talk about what kind of ink, what kind of stamps you've got. So these stamps that you end up with will range from rubber stamps, which are probably the best stamps of all because they can deal with very high heats and they generally stamp beautifully because they take ink. So the rubber stamps can take all three all three of these ink pads. Okay, so your rubber stamps are probably the best ones. The next best ones are your photopolymer, for example, the range that I've brought out. Photopolymer also can take heat. Of course, they got the added advantage of being clear, so you can see through them. And these also can take all these different ink pads. Okay. And then you've got your quite solid, slightly less good quality, but still pretty good. You've got your acrylic or silicone stamps. Now Inkadinka are not bad, because although they aren't the best quality, even though they're not the best quality material, they're relatively solid. They're not too bad in terms of what you can stamp with. But you might find that your Memento ink pad might struggle a little bit. So to get a good image with your acrylic or silicone based stamps, you're probably better with your StazOn, and you're going to be very good with your VersaFine. And finally, you've got your free stamps, which generally are of the absolute poorest quality. So for example, this came with a stamping magazine. I love the images though. So instead of despairing and feeling you can't stamp with them, I would say really the only ink pad that's going to deal with an extremely squidgy, rather low quality acrylic stamp is going to be your VersaFine, okay? But bear in mind this takes a while to dry. So I'm just going to quickly show you the different ways of stamping. The other thing that you need, of which I have a couple, is you need maybe a stamping mat. You need something. Now these are going to be on sale, and the first 2 people that message me will be able to buy one of these stamp pads off me. They're £6.50. They're 30 by 40 centimetres and they're 8mm thick, and they're the ones that Phil Martin raves on about. So you need some sort of give. Now I'm not going to use this, I've got my own one that I've got, but these are extremely good quality and they allow the stamped image to be brilliant. So don't forget, message me. The first 2 people that message me can get one of these for £6.50 and plus postage. Okay, so I'm going to use my own stamping pad, which is rather used, but well used, but it's a similar kind of concept. So top quality card, I'm going to use one of the Centura Pearl pieces of card. Obviously I use the non shiny side, and we're going to start with the rubber stamp, which is probably the best stamp because they stamp beautifully and you don't have much problem at all. So with this stamp I apply it to an acrylic block. The bigger the stamp, the bigger the acrylic block you need. And then I'm going to, for this one, I'm going to colour it in with pro markers, okay? But because of this image being so beautiful, you don't really need to colour it in much at all, okay? So with a rubber stamp, you generally get very good images, but let's wait and see, hey? Okay, so you need to hold your acrylic box steadily, look where you're going to go, press down, and then make sure you press quite hard down on all the parts of the stamp. I sometimes stand up and give it some welly, and because of this stamping mat, then you get quite a decent bit of pressure. Take that off, and I'd say it's pretty darn good. Okay, so I'm used Memento with that. Okay, and then you can colour in using pro markers. So I'm just going to colour her hat. Okay, so remember, dye-based ink, Memento with alcohol markers, otherwise you'll have problems. You cannot use StazOn as an ink pad with your pro markers. So that stamps beautifully. Okay, and that's colouring in brilliantly. There's no problems, there's no smudging, you're on to a winner. Okay, so Memento ink pad with pro markers or alcohol based, so that'll be your Spectrum Noirs. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one, so that's the next best quality or just as good quality, is your photopolymer. So I'm just obviously going to show you using my my range. So these are photopolymer, top-notch quality. So with these, I'm going to use my StazOn. Okay, so I'm going to use my StazOn, apply that. So StazOn is solvent-based. So this is when you're using watercolours, basically. So I'm just going to find like just a pale bluey colour. So I'm going to use another piece of card. This time I'll try out my stamping card. Let's see how good it is. So I'm just going to stick this down again, give it some welly. Okay, you can push quite hard with photopolymer because they don't squidge. Oh no. Okay, we'll try that again. Okay, so obviously my StazOn is drying out a little bit. So let's try again. Also, I was faffing around trying to find the right pen, so that might have not helped either. So there you go. Okay, you've got to work fast, basically. That was the problem. I took too long. I was faffing about. So there you go. You've got a beautifully stamped image that stays on. But this can only be used with, let's make our sheep slightly blue or sort of grey blue. So let's just colour him in. Just the little dude at the front. Okay. And here we've got we've used a distress marker, a water-based, and there's no smudging at all because you've used Stays On. Okay, the next one that you're going to use is we're going to use your relatively good quality Inkadinkado stamps, but they are acrylics, they're not quite as good. Try and use an acrylic block that's more the right size. If it's too big, you can have issues with excess ink, etc. So that with this one, you're pushing it a little bit, even with Stays On. So I would say use your VersaFine, your oil-based ink, and it takes beautifully. If you used another ink with this, it would bubble up. Okay, so here is, I'll just use my Centura Pearl just to keep things moving. Okay, so I'll stamp this little dude. Now with these, you don't want to squash quite so hard because they're more squidgy. Okay, so be careful with those. Okay, and with your VersaFine, look at that, absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely brilliant. And if you tried to use your mementos, it wouldn't have been as good. It really wouldn't. Okay. In terms of colouring this in, well, you'd probably have to wait a little bit, but you can colour in with pretty much anything. Let's just see what it says on the back. It says perfect for outlined image and watercolouring. So again, this would be for your distress markers or your watercolours. And finally, let's see how we get on with the ultimate cheapo ones, well, free ones really. So we'll find a decent block size. Again, try and choose a block size that's about the right size. Make sure it's big enough to handle it. And with this, again, you're talking VersaFine. Otherwise, you're going to be stuffed. Okay, I haven't actually used the stamp yet, so we'll see how it gets on, but it should be all right. Okay, let's use some stamping cards. Okay, let's get rid of these little smudges. Okay, and finally, let's try the VersaFine. So again, don't press too hard. Give it a, press it down slightly, but bear in mind that these are squidgy stamps. And I'd say for a free stamp, because you've used the right products, you've got your stamping mat, you've got your decent quality card. This is the hourly stamping card, and because you've used VersaFine, you end up with a brilliant stamp design. Okay, but if you were really struggling, and there's one final thing to tell you, if you've got a stamp that's got a large amount of flat surface, so for example on this stamp here, there's a lot of flat surface which can sometimes cause problems. Okay, the way to solve that is to use, like, I've got a sanding block here. You use the least abrasive one, so I think it's this one here, and you just slightly sand down the stamp, because what you'll find is it will mean that the ink will catch better onto the slightly sanded. It's not going to ruin your stamp. Okay, don't do this with your rubber stamps, but with your clear stamps, if there's any problems there, now the ink should take better. Okay, so just in summary, what you need is probably 3 main ink pads. You need your oil-based for your real tough ones, which are going to struggle. Okay, in terms of if they're acrylic and cheap stamps, squidgy stamps sort of thing, the oil-based is the best. If you want to do watercolouring, you need to use your Stays On. Okay, your solvent ink pad, can have all sorts of different colours in Stays On. And finally, if you want to use your pro markers or your alcohol-based inks, pens, then Memento is the best one to use. Okay, I hope that's helped. And also, just to remind you, I have 2 stamping mats in stock at the moment, Phil Martin's recommendation. 30 by 40 centimetres. These are the beasts, basically. These are the ones, okay? So for £6.50, I can send one of these to you. If you message me, I can get cracking with that. So just let me know if you want one of these. And I hope that that's helped. And I'll do a video on embossing powder using a heat gun. Thanks very much. Bye.